So welcome to our podcast, Science Podcasting Greater Than or Equal to 101. Actually, my co-host today was asking me about the title, basically 101 and beyond, let's say. So before we get started, you're probably wondering who exactly is talking to you. So my name is Shane Hanlon. I work for the American Geophysical Union. I'm a PhD by training. I have a science ecology background, and now for AGU, the American Geophysical Union, I work in our Sharing Science program, which I'll talk about in a second. But basically, my job is to help scientists with the skills, tools, whatever they might need to communicate to broader audiences. And I'm also one of the producers and co-hosts for our podcast in-house, Third Pod from the Sun. We're relatively new. We just launched earlier this year. And our whole idea is that we want to talk to AGU scientists about what they do, and more importantly, about the stuff that doesn't make it into the manuscript. So their methods, them as people, the background that you wouldn't necessarily read in the paper, hear in a lecture, that type of thing.
And my name is Ryan Haupt. I am finishing my PhD at the University of Wyoming. I do not work for AGU, but I am a podcaster. I've been podcasting since I was in undergrad, so since 2009, coming up on 10 years. And the Science Sort of Podcast has produced over 300 episodes at this point. And it's definitely a less formal show from sort of a bygone era of the podcasting ecosphere where we try to recreate the kind of conversations that would happen during a lab happy hour, give scientists the opportunity to explain their work in their own words, with editing to make them sound good, but not editing them for content in the way that a traditional media outlet might. And so we just want to give scientists the opportunity to talk to their colleagues in a way that doesn't make it sound like they're at a lectern or giving a press interview. And we have a lot of fun with it.
And so just real quick before we get started, for those of you who aren't familiar with AGU or the Sharing Science program, AGU, we're a big science society. We represent over 60,000 Earth and space scientists. As part of that is the Sharing Science program. Like I said, our whole idea is to help scientists talk to literally anyone, from non-science public to press, policymakers, even fellow scientists. And one of the ways we do that is through these webinars, but also our bread and butter is are kind of these workshops that we do in person at institutions. We have a ton of online resources. And so we encourage you, regardless of whether you're an AGU member or not, if you're an Earth and space scientist or not, to check out what we do. Our main goal is to just serve all scientists and help them be better communicators. All right, so this is probably redundant considering that you're here today, but one of the first questions, if you're thinking about podcasting, is why podcast in the first place?
And so podcasts, I guess, technically can be video, but the vast majority of podcasts are audio. And having done this for a number of years, I've actually taken a number of workshops and worked with radio production people. And I've learned a few things about audio as a format that I might not have known otherwise that I want to share with you guys. And one is that both writing and audio, even though they are not visual media, can invoke visuals. So you can get your reader or your listener to create a scene in their mind that you couldn't necessarily do otherwise. And one of the limitations to that is that audio can be not as good at conveying a sense of scale, but it is really good at giving a sensation or a feeling. And so the sentence, "the forest seemed to stretch on forever," might put the idea or image of a very large forest in your mind, but then we can actually show you an image of a giant, Amazonian forest. And that is a very immediate visual input that shows you what it looks like to see a forest of that size. But if I want to give you a sensation of what it feels like to be in that forest, audio can actually be a little bit better. And so we're going to just see if this works. And so now, with this kind of background noise playing, hopefully you get the sensation of like, oh, this must be what it feels like to be in the forest, in that forest that stretches on forever and ever. And by just using the audio of a forestscape, I think you can achieve that in a very clean and interesting way that you can't necessarily easily do with a visual component. So audio does have its benefits, even though there are some limitations too. A couple more benefits of podcasting. So this joke in the image here, if you haven't seen the meme going around, but podcasting, there's an intimacy to it, and when that intimacy, you develop sort of a relationship with your listener, so it feels like the people producing the podcast are your friends, even if you've never met them, so that's kind of what's going on in the image. But in addition to that, podcasts are very economical to produce. They don't cost a lot of money to get up and running or maintain. They're very convenient because they download right to a listener's device, usually a smartphone. It's in their pocket, ready for them to go the second you put out that content. You get a really consistent engagement with your audience because people, when they do listen to the show, they will also tend to subscribe to the show. And so you know that you've got an audience who's going to stick with you. And then getting back around to the image in the slide, when you're talking directly into somebody's ears through headphones, usually when they're doing something solitary or on their own, there's actually a great deal of intimacy that can be generated through that process. And people really do connect with you as a personality and as a voice in their daily routine in a way that doesn't necessarily happen to the sportscasters they see on ESPN. So there's a true intimacy that can be achieved through podcasting.
So one thing you'll want to ask yourself if you're starting a podcast, or even maybe if you've been doing it for a while, just like, why are you doing it in the first place? Like, what do you want your content to be? Who do you want it to involve? Just all of these questions, and that's really important. When we were starting our third pod, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, we wanted to say, we said that we didn't just want it to be another science podcast, and the science thing doesn't have that much to do with it, just another podcast. And what we meant by that was we wanted it to be something that we hadn't necessarily heard before, or at least in this exact iteration. There are other interview podcasts out there. We understand that, but we wanted to do something that was a little bit different. So make sure, our suggestion is to ask yourself, like, why do you want to do this in the first place? And because we are scientists, there's actually some good stats out there. This is from a really comprehensive review of science podcasts, particularly. There's a lot going on here. But what I want to draw your attention to is this idea of how many episodes on average are released for science podcasts and what's the average lifespan. And you see a pretty quick drop off with episodes released and with lifespan. And Brian, what's the phrase?
Pod fading.
Pod fading, yeah. So if this is something you want to do and you don't want your podcast to only last, say, a year or for whatever reason, doing a lot of the back end work, a lot of the prep work ahead of time to really figure out like why you want to do this and what you're going to do rather than just jumping into it can probably prevent you from fading away.
And another thing I'll add to this is a lot of podcasts are transitioning from just we're going to put out an episode every month like a magazine to more of we're going to put out a season of the show and then go on a hiatus and refigure out what we're going to do. And I think that's perfectly valid. So if you think I can commit to doing 12 episodes, but then I'm going to take a little bit of a break, I think that's fine. But I think part of what Shane is saying is think about that ahead of time so that it doesn't sound like it was an after the fact, we couldn't keep up with the production, so we're calling it a season. Go into it with that attitude in mind and know what your intentions are before you begin. I also want to talk a little bit about that whole finding your niche in the podcasting ecosystem. You're talking to two ecology-themed people, so this is kind of our view of the world. And this here is the top 40 or so science and medicine podcasts, specifically in the natural sciences category on iTunes. And something you might not realize about the way podcasts are categorized on iTunes is that when you submit a podcast to iTunes, you tell iTunes what category you want to be in. iTunes does zero curation of that. They just put you wherever it is you say you want to be. And so if you analyze this image for a little bit, you'll see that some of the podcasts on here are probably very good content. So you've got things like Radiolab and Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson and a show from AAAS and Science Versus and, hey, look, there's my show and Story Collider. There's another show that we're friends with. And so there's a lot of good content on there, but you'll also see that there's a Real Ghost Stories, a paranormal podcast, a Sasquatch Chronicles. And so I think when it comes to science podcasting, there's a little bit of a Bigfoot in the room, because I don't know that Hillbilly Horror Stories ought to be number 9 in all of the science podcasting out there. But because there's no way to actually tell iTunes, hey, these podcasts shouldn't be here, because iTunes just lets people put themselves where they want to be, the only way to actually overtake them in this space is to put out more different kinds of shows that are truly science shows that are popular and better produced than these shows. And so essentially we can't scrub them out of here, but we can beat them at their own game. And that's why I want to encourage you, if you're considering science podcasting, I think your voice is a necessary voice out there and will contribute to improving this situation for all of us.
So you've thought about, so you think about why do you want to do this, what do you want to go into it, and your motivations, selfish or otherwise. A really important question is, who are you trying to talk to? Like, who do you want your audience to be? And so this actually just came out a couple weeks ago, but podcast listenership overall in America in this survey is going up. So we've gone from, say, in 2006, somewhere maybe in the 11-12% range, up to close to 50% of Americans 12 and older listening to podcasts. And that is a huge amount of people listening to podcasts. And so there's a lot of folks out there, so there's a really broad audience.
And a similar survey that was conducted and put out in this Share of the Ear report, which comes out once a year, and you can find all of the data and the slides from this presentation just by Googling that Share of the Ear podcast thing. They found that around 24% of Americans are listening to podcasts, and in comparison to the previous slide, the 50% number, the 24% here means Americans that listen to podcasts as part of their regular routine, not just people that have heard of the platform and have listened to an episode. These are subscribers. And they found that these people tend to be more highly educated than the average American. And what that means specifically in that context is they've graduated high school and have some level of college. They also found that people tend to subscribe to 7 podcasts per week, or tend to listen to 7 podcasts per week, and that they listen to about 6.5 hours of audio content, which is compared to 4 for the average American. And they also found that once people subscribe to podcasts, they tend to listen to podcasts at the exclusion of other types of audio content. So essentially, once you can convert someone to being a podcast listener, they're very likely to be retained as a podcast listener moving forward.
And so with the audience, like, you're trying to figure out who do you actually want to reach. And again, because scientist, I can't help myself, some interesting data out there on science podcasts in particular. So here you have podcast topics, and a lot of podcasts, especially science podcasts, are more just about general science. And then you can kind of see how the distribution comes out. But for this one, looking at the second part here about target audiences, and of the science podcasts out there, a large majority of them are trying to target the public. Now, this word means a whole lot of things. For our purposes, we're just basically going to say like any non-science public. And maybe even actual scientists too, who just aren't in your field. So basically just not targeting your peers in many ways. And something I want to say as well, I forgot to mention at the top, but there's a question box on the side in your little go-to webinar program. And so we're getting some questions already. And if you have questions throughout, type them in there, and we'll answer all of them at the end. We have a ton of time at the end for questions. And my calendar that I should have shut, that I thought I did. All right, so with your audience, as much as you can, because if you're just going to like the non-science public, there's a lot of people out there, but to the best of your abilities, like, figure out what you want to get out of it. Like, what are your goals? Why are you doing this in the first place? But on the flip side of that, what do you think your audience's goals are? Like, non-science public, okay, but is it kids, teenagers? Are there like professional dynamics there? Are there life stage dynamics? Are you reaching out to certain groups? So try to figure out, like, who are you going for? Science interested folks, or folks who have never thought about science? You want to break into that world? Like, what are their goals? Who makes them up? Or their values, their concerns, whatever that might be. Science podcasting, I guess podcasting more generally, but it's just like doing any sort of science communication in the way that you need to think about who you're getting out to. Because if you have no idea like really who your audience is, and you don't really know what your content's going to be. And so you know why you're doing it, you know who you're talking to. Well, okay, how do you do it though? This is all great until you actually get down to brass tacks of like, what are we using to record and that type of thing.
Yeah, so the live or the studio really just is kind of a very broad question of, most of us don't have access to a true audio recording studio, but audio is actually one of the easier types of media to learn to produce reasonably well on your own. And learning to use good techniques, regardless of the technology you buy, can overcome a lot of other obstacles. So I often try to tell people that learning good mic technique, learning how to use your gear, so whatever gear you end up buying, actually read the manual and practice with it enough that you feel very comfortable with it, can overcome a lot of bad technique, even if you're using some of the best gear available. The general trade-off that I've found, and Shane has confirmed this, is that the more effort you put in when you're recording, the less effort it's going to take to edit that into something listenable, and then that's also reversible. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're like, oh, this is a great moment that I want to capture, and you just pull out your phone and record a voice memo, as long as you are committing to taking the time to edit that and make it sound good later, it can still sound very good. You just have to realize that that's the trade-off that you're getting when you do that. So that's another one of those, think about it before you step into the step into the water, and just know that that's kind of how the math is going to play out. No matter what your setup, there are certain tips and tricks that sort of always work. There's a very simple piece of equipment called a pop filter that you can attach to the front of any sort of microphone. And what this does is essentially a mesh or metal screen that reduces what are called vocal plosives. So when we say the word pop, you can feel that there's a little bit of breathy air coming out from between your lips. That can cause a spike in your microphone's recording that is very unpleasant to listen to and very difficult to edit around. And so one of the ways you can get rid of that is using something called a pop filter. It works sonically the same way that your microwave screen door blocks the microwave waves from coming out. It just interrupts the wave and prevents it from reaching the source, which in this case is the microphone. There's also something called a room print. So you can think of this as like an audio fingerprint for wherever it is you're recording. And what that means is whenever you're recording anything, you want to record a few seconds of silence just to absorb what the sound of the room is. And then most audio editing software have noise removal tools that you can then apply to your audio later. Those tools work way better if you've taken like a 5-second room print. A lot of radio professionals I know say that can be this very intimate time between you and your interviewee, because you just sit there and look into each other's eyes holding the microphone in between you. But get the room print however you want. It does help a lot. And then there's a technique, generally this goes for basically any microphone out there. It's called Eat the Mic, and you want to be a lot closer to the microphone than you think you need to be. This applies if you're giving a conference talk, if you're using one of the stand-up comedy style microphones on stage, or using a podcasting microphone, even in a more classical studio setup. Just be very close to the microphone, because the goal is to pick up your voice and as little else as possible, and the best way to do that is just to get your face right up in there. There's a website called transom.org that a lot of friends of mine who do actual radio production love, and especially in their tools section, they talk a lot about the different kinds of microphones out there, very in-depth explanations of how audio recording technology works, reviews and guides to people who are just getting started and have never purchased any audio equipment before. And it's just a great website in general for people looking to get into more of the nitty-gritty of just how recording audio works.
So when you're thinking about recording, the first thing you need to do is to get a mic, or think about what your microphone is going to be. And this can take very many different forms depending on what you want to do, what your budget is, the types of materials you have. So you can use your phone, you can use a handheld recorder. There's fancier versions that say actually different types of microphones. So the type of microphone that we use for our recording is the one on the bottom here with the pink background. So this is just a unidirectional dynamic mic. It's really basic, but it works really well for our purposes. And it's unidirectional, meaning you have to be right in front of it. You have to have this correct mic placement, like Ryan was talking about.
Yeah, basically think of like a laser beam coming out, and you're trying to put your mouth around the laser beam. That's how you want to talk into this microphone.
Yeah, and for us, it works really great. We record in a bunch of different places. We do live recording, or we record in person, but we're in all types of different places. And so this reduces the amount of excess noise and background noise that we get, so it works quite well for us.
And I use a very similar microphone. So for a long time, I used a microphone put out by the company Blue, which is not a paid endorsement or anything, but they do a lot of good, consumer level USB microphones if you want to record plugged into your computer. I now use a microphone that can plug in using the cable you see from the microphone Shane pointed out, which is a very specific audio production cable, but the microphone I have also has that USB functionality. And the only main difference between our mics is mine records on what's called a cardioid pattern, which is essentially a heart-shaped pattern. So that means that most of the recording is at the front of the mic, but some of the recording is coming from the sides and from the back, and that just rounds out the sound a little bit and gives you a little bit richer, fuller sound at the expense of reducing less of that side noise that Shane was worried about, because if you're outdoors or in the field, you definitely want a microphone that is focused on the thing you're trying to record and not focused on recording every other little thing in your environment.
Yeah, or at a conference, which is where a lot of our
and then we mentioned the phone, and the phone actually is a very decent microphone at this point when used properly. So I have friends who do radio production, and they say that when they want to do a phone interview, they actually ask the person if there's a landline that they can call. They talk to the person over the landline and then ask the interviewee to record themselves using the voice memo on their phone and then send them the file, because that tends to produce a better recording than just recording straight over the phone would. So a phone is definitely an approachable, easy to use. Everybody's already got one choice that used properly can still produce good audio.
Yeah, and with your microphone, you're also going to want to record, and there's a whole slew of different ways to record. And so, again, if you're talking into a phone, you can record on your phone. I mean, you're getting audio files from there in other ways as well. So, I mean, a phone is a really great option. If you are going to go out and actually purchase equipment, there's a whole bunch of things shown here. There's different soundboards. People record straight into their computers. Again, what we use, because we're doing in-person interviews, currently is the recorder you see on the right-hand side. It's a Zoom. There's a Tascam makes one. There's a whole bunch of these different things, but it's really great. It just has an SD card in it, and you plug a mic directly into it, but also there's 2 points at the top are also microphones. So we can pull in direct sound from the microphones that we're plugging into it. We can get a couple tracks, and then we can also record ambient noise, or let's say if you're recording like a show or something, you can record an audience as well. So for us, this works really well.
And it's able to record everything on separate tracks, which is really nice because you can plug in multiple microphones into the bottom of that. I have one too. And when you get time to edit, you will find that if you can record the different people you're talking to, either you can use really good mic technique and get both people on one mic by moving your hand back and forth. That actually does take a fair bit of skill, and radio people have to learn how to do that. I find that it's much better just to hand the person a microphone, record 2 tracks, and then you have 2 separate audio files that you can edit separately. Very much more convenient for me. The image at the bottom of the screen here is the software that I use because I end up recording a lot over Skype or Google Hangouts. And this is a little program for Mac called Audio Hijack Pro. Again, not a paid plug, but what it does is it's able to record a Skype conversation in an uncompressed, lossless, very large file format size, and it's able to split the incoming Skype call from my own voice, so I end up with 2 separate tracks that I can record from that way. This program can also be used to record a Google Hangout, or I can just record straight to my computer using a microphone. So it's a pretty multifunctional little piece of software that can make podcasting remotely a lot easier to do. And Skype is also getting ready to put out a built-in recording feature as well. It remains to be seen how well that will actually work for podcasting, but it's nice that they're finally coming around to that idea. Now, one last caveat I want to put out there, just because it's something I've heard in my 10-ish years of doing podcasting, and it's that, but I hate the sound of my voice. I understand that. It's a very common thing. Part of the reason that we sound different when we're recorded and played back than we sound in our own heads is because there's a lot of stuff going on inside your head. There's sinuses and cavities and mucous membranes and things like that cause your voice to bounce around and echo inside your own skull, so that when it does reach your ears, both internally and externally, it sounds different than the people who are just listening to you externally. So what I will say, and this is meant in the kindest possible way, is that the way you sound when you are recorded and played back is the way that everyone else hears you, and we're all fine with it. You sound great. We like your voice. Don't worry about it. There's a self-consciousness that you will have to overcome, but it does eventually happen. You do eventually hear yourself so often that you get over it, and that's all I can say is just, if that's the thing that's holding you back, don't let it hold you back, because it is something you can get past, and nobody else is as worried about it as you are.
Yeah, for many years I had that exact thing.
Well, it makes sense.
Of course it does, yeah. I joke that I have a voice that's perfect for like podcasts on public radio, so me and Ira Glass. But it is one of those things. The more I hear it, the more it's fine. And now it's just yeah, it's like you said, it's what everyone out there is hearing, and so it's no different. It's just because it's not what you're hearing.
I still hate to see myself on video if it's any consolation. I never know what to do with my hands.
It's a little bit different. All right, and so you have all this stuff. Well, then what do you do with it? And I'm going to let Brian take this because we at AGU actually don't do anything with it. We send it to folks to actually do the editing.
Which is a great solution if you can afford it. We started off not being able to afford it. So when we started off doing the show, the technology was pretty different, and we were also looking to keep it as cheap as possible. But editing is a part of the show that I believe is totally non-optional. I think there's no audio that can't be made better with a little bit of editing, but it is the part of podcasting that feels the most like homework. And so you just got to power through it and get to that final product. Free options are programs like Audacity, which is available at the website on the screen. It is cross-platform. You can use it on any Mac, PC, or Linux. GarageBand is a free option that's pre-installed on Macs. I believe it has some built-in functionality for podcasting, but I've honestly never used it. Then there are non-free options, which I've kind of ranked in levels of difficulty to learn how to use. So things like Hindenburg, Reaper are kind of prosumer level, pretty good. A lot of features, not that expensive. Something like Adobe Audition is approaching sort of a professional level audio editing system. And then Pro Tools, that same kind of thing. So like when you're listening to This American Life, it was edited in a software like Pro Tools. I use Adobe Audition. I switched a couple of years ago when I had to buy the Creative Cloud for other programs that I needed, but it came with this really nice audio editing software. And there is a learning curve associated with all of these. I find the learning curve with Audacity to be pretty low. It's the one you see on the screen here. And it essentially, each of those blue tracks is a separate track that can be edited individually or edited all three in sync. So you have a lot of functionality there, and it's pretty straightforward in terms of what each thing does. So if you need to delete an you can go and select the cursor and just literally select the the same way you would select if it was written in text on Microsoft Word, and then just hit delete and it's gone. So I find that to be a pretty approachable way to get started. It has a lot of other built-in tools like fade-ins, fade-outs if you want to put in music behind you. And then it also exports things to MP3s and the other file formats that you're going to need when you're actually ready to put your content out there. Plus lots of plugins and things for noise removal. And if you get it set up the way you want, you can actually do a lot with it, even though it's free. Now, I think when I had to learn how to use Adobe Audition, I ended up using a website called lynda.com, which is a LinkedIn company that provides professional level training for different kinds of software. I got it free through my university, but I also could get it free through the DC Public Library. So check and see if your public library offers it for free. And it is a really nice way. It took me the better part of a day, so maybe like 8 to 12 hours of dedicated time working through the videos on that site to learn how to use Adobe Audition. And now I feel like I can do a pretty good job. Fortunately, editing just people talking is a lot simpler and easier than editing things like music or singing. So it's not that hard to learn how to do well, but it is something you're going to have to invest some time and some energy in. And there is a learning curve, so just don't let the learning curve discourage you, and take advantage of tools like YouTube or Lynda to learn tips and tricks that way.
And finally, so we'll talk a little bit about like hosting a podcast. So you want to have a rapport with if you're hosting with multiple people, which I think we kind of illustrated here. But hosting in a different way as well. We're talking about like hosting your actual platform, like hosting, where does your podcast live? And there's a whole slew of different places for podcasts to live. And what this means is where's the actual audio file? So if it's a WAV or an MP3 or whatever else. And there's a whole bunch of different ones out there. We, Third Pod from the Sun, we use this site called Blueberry, and as well as SoundCloud. I think Brian, y'all use Lisbon and SoundCloud. They're analogous websites, but this doesn't mean that we're not hosting anything on iTunes. Maybe you can.
Yeah. So iTunes. So some confusion I've realized that people have when it comes to podcasting is none of the podcasts that you listen to or find through iTunes are actually hosted by Apple. Our files are never on an Apple server at any point in their lifetime. I log into the Libsyn website, and that's where I upload my file, and then Libsyn essentially lets iTunes point to the link that Libsyn hosts. And so That's good and bad, but it does mean that even though we're available on iTunes, you have to pay for a service to actually host the MP3 files. If you have a personal website, a lot of times you can host files on that website, and if you want to go ahead and submit those files using the proper channels to iTunes, that's possible, but these services just make it a lot easier and more streamlined to do that. Plus, a lot of web hosting tends to not like it if you're putting giant media files up there that are going to get downloaded a ton of times. So that's the role that sites like Libsyn, Blueberry, and SoundCloud fill, is they're ones taking the server hit and working with iTunes to keep everything streamlined and smooth. And they do cost a little bit of money, but what you're paying for is you're paying for that iTunes integration, you're paying for the actual hosting of the files, and then you're paying for some level of statistics of who's downloading the show, where are they downloading it from, what part of the world, what technology they're using, how are they finding your website, and how many total downloads are you getting. So each of these different services have different tiered levels, and you can pay for exactly kind of what you expect you'll need and change it as needed. So that's sort of the hosting situation, I guess.
Yeah, and if you're just starting out too, SoundCloud does offer a free option up until, I don't know what the space requirement is, but it's a decent number of episodes. We actually had to just upgrade to a paid version of SoundCloud. So if you don't know if you're going to stick with this or just want to try it out, SoundCloud is a good place to start because you can be free for at least a little bit. So you don't have to make that initial investment. You can invest elsewhere if you can. And Ryan already said you can actually host just on your page if that's like the option you have. But also there's a lot of really great ways. If you're using these different services, you can then integrate them into websites. So for us, we host our website through the WordPress service, and actually there's actual code that we can just plug into our website, and it pulls an episode out and creates this really nice player for us. And
it's the same through us. We have a Squarespace site, and we used to have a WordPress site, and we actually used Blueberry back when we had the WordPress site, but now that we have the Squarespace site, we just decided to go all in on SoundCloud, and so we have a listen to the podcast. So each episode has show notes, and you can stream the episode from the show notes page, or you can stream any of our episodes from our listen to the show page, which is going through SoundCloud. So the integration has only gotten better in the 10 years since I've been doing podcasting. It used to be super janky, and even when it worked, it looked terrible. So it's a lot better off and easier to figure out than it used to be, for sure. There are some challenges, though, if you want to start a podcast. So as much as we think it's great, we're not going to pretend that it's without its hurdles. And one of the biggest challenges is just convincing people to listen to a podcast. So like we said, it's only about 50% of Americans that have even attempted to check out this new media at this point. One of the hurdles is, if somebody's not already a listener, it's very hard. You kind of just have to take their phone from them and subscribe for them and then give them their phone back. All Apple phones at this point come with the purple podcast app that you see on your screen pre-installed. There are a number of different podcatchers is the type of app that can also download podcasts if you don't like the one from the fruit. And Android, I don't think, comes with anything standard, but there are a lot of also good and some free options for getting podcasts on your Android phone. Then there's also the challenge of building an audience, which ties into listener saturation. So once you get somebody who's willing to listen to podcasts, I have found that people discover podcasting, subscribe to about the number of podcasts they can fit into their daily routine, and then they don't really want to subscribe to any more podcasts. So they get saturated, and they're just not that interested in new shows anymore. And so even once you've gotten people into podcasting, you then have to still overcome that hurdle of getting them to listen to your show specifically. And it just takes time. It just takes the continued production of quality content, and eventually, I believe, the audience will be there for that if you keep up with it. And then the technology and production challenges are just that we've covered some of the bare minimum basics. It is sort of a piece it together as you go and figure things out for yourself kind of environment right now. And every podcast I know, does things a little bit differently. And usually those differences are just because of what they figured out works best for them over time. And so I often say that podcasts are an interesting mixture of intelligent design and natural evolution, because you do your best to intelligently design something when you start, and you find that it still evolves into a different place as you go, and I think that's okay. You just got to be prepared for that journey.
And so we've really kind of tailored this to, like, if you're going to start a podcast, if you've already started one, like, how do you grow on that? But maybe you don't want to start a podcast, or maybe you're just being interviewed for a podcast. And For, like, it's going to be different depending on where you are. For us, because we're doing everything in person, we really coach people. And we can set up the situation, and we can really control the situation. But it's not always like that.
Yeah, so a lot of the interviews I've conducted over the years of doing a podcast have been over things like Skype or the phone. And it's because we want to make our guests sound as good as possible. I've become a bit of an evangelist for telling people how to get good audio regardless of the situation they find themselves in. So there are a few things you can do to make a podcast host life a little bit easier if you want to, and just so you sound better in the interview. And one thing is to find a quiet room. A lot of soft stuff in it is good. So you can see in the image here, if you ignore the Golden Girls, you'll see that there's like foam mattressing all along the walls and the ceiling. And that's actually a great sound dampener. It looks very similar to the actual professional grade audio foam that would be in a real studio. But even a coat closet or just putting a blanket around the microphone and you, or a pillow behind the microphone, these things all help. You just want to reduce echoes. If you're using an external microphone plugged into your computer, computers don't always recognize those microphones right away, so just double check before you start recording or before you start being recorded through Skype that it's actually the external microphone that's picking up the sound. If you're using an internal microphone, typing and clicking on a mouse can be very, very loud on a laptop, so just be aware of that and try to avoid it if you can. If you have a smartphone that has the headphones with the microphone built in, those are actually pretty good microphones. You can get a pretty decent recording with those. And if you're going to wear that as headphones and the microphone, just be very, very aware that it's not rubbing against any hair or clothing or jewelry, because that creates a very unpleasant scratching sound. And no matter what kind of microphone you're using, you definitely want to wear headphones. You don't want the people interviewing you's voice coming out the speakers and getting picked up by your mic, because that can create an echo that's really unpleasant and hard to edit around. And then just the final thing that I think Shane and I both want to say is, when we produce a podcast, we're putting in a fair amount of effort, and it's effort that's essentially promoting the scientific work that's being done by the person we're interviewing. And so when the episode comes out, help us out in promoting it. If you have a Twitter account, retweet the episode when it comes out. Tell your friends, hey, I was on this podcast, and I think it actually came out pretty well. I'd love for you to go listen to it. So help us do the work of spreading the word, especially because it's your work we're promoting, and we're all really proud of the product and the work that we're showcasing. So just and I say this as much for myself as for the guests, because I sometimes also need a little kick in the pants to be self-promotional, and so let's all just big each other up.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of concern out there, I think, about self-promotion, especially in the sciences. But I mean, this is like really great work, and this is trying to get whatever your message is, whatever you decide you end up wanting to do, out to really broad audiences, and they're not going to hear about it unless you put the effort in to actually try and get it out there. So like we, the people interviewing you, will do as much as possible, but we have our own audiences, and so maybe you can actually help expand that audience. So it can be nothing but helpful. All right, so this is our very quick and dirty kind of podcasting 101. So now what? Well, first, because this is Sharing Science and AGU, I just want to let you know about some of the things if you're interested in science communication, policy, podcasting, press, that type of thing. We have a whole slew of resources out there. And if you're not catching these as we're going through, if you're listening to us now, you have a copy of this presentation afterwards, or excuse me, the webinar afterwards, so you'll be able to reference this stuff later. Follow us. So Science Sort of is on Twitter. The Sharing Science program, which is, we'll put the third pod through the sun through that. That's on Twitter. Ryan's on Twitter. I'm on Twitter. So we talk a lot of science and a lot of other things too. So if you're interested in that, please follow us. This should be obvious, but please check out our podcasts. Third Pod from the Sun, Science Sort of. You can find us where you find all your other podcasts. And also do a quick pitch for the Story Collider. So I, Shane, am also involved with the Story Collider, where folks tell true personal stories about science on stage. But these stories are then recorded and then pushed out a podcast every week. So if you're looking for science stories from scientists and non-scientists alike, you can check out Story Collider as well. And then if you're interested, again, in this type of outreach, communication, policy, whatever it might be, check out Sharing Science more broadly. We have a whole slew of resources and other webinars as well that you can look into. And at this time, so we have a bunch of time left, and we're going to start answering some questions. First, I'll throw a softball one out there for Ryan. What podcast do you listen to? Like, what's what are some of your favorite ones?
I think I subscribe to too many podcasts, so I'm in a constant fight to keep my phone's memory from being completely eaten up by podcasting. But I really think 99% Invisible, Roman Mars' show out of Oakland, is consistently some of the best audio storytelling I hear produced. It's up there with Radiolab and This American Life, in my opinion, and I think the topics he decides to cover are very interesting. We have a sister show, two sister shows actually. We have a sister show called In Defense of Plants, which is a botany podcast, and we have another sister show called The Titanium Physicist, which is a physics podcast. Both of those I think are worth your time. And then I tend to listen to a lot of comedy shows just to make myself laugh. So I really like Harmontown, and there's a show called Never Seen It where a comedian rewrites a famous movie that they've never seen, and they act out the script as the podcast, and it's pretty hilarious. Yeah, so those are kind of the shows that I go to. I think Reply All, I was telling Shane about that one earlier, which is the show about the internet, is very good. Allie Ward has an interview show called Ologies, where she just interviews a different person with an ology in their title.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah, that's a good one too. That's worth checking out. Shane's pulling out his phone to subscribe.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of mine. So in the science realm, I actually don't have a ton of like science-y podcasts. I do science for a living, so I actually like getting away from the science personally for the podcast. But I mean, Radiolab's on there. I obviously self-subscribe to both the podcasts I'm involved in. But I tend to, I like This American Life. I really like Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, and people have very strong feelings about Malcolm Gladwell. It's called Revisionist History. It's really interesting. I like Radiolab's More Perfect, which is the political version. But this is I'm going through, I have 20 or 30 on here. And
I listen to a show called The Sporkful, which is a food podcast.
I like The Sporkful, yeah.
That I like a lot. Dan Pashman's show.
Yeah, so as you can tell, we have similar and different tastes, but there's so much out there. And so I encourage you all to go exploring and maybe once in a while kind of get out of your comfort zone. I need to be told that to myself once in a while to pick up a new podcast.
There's a show called The Dollop, which is an American history podcast where one comedian has researched an American history story and reads it to another comedian who's never heard it, and so he just responds to the insanity in real time. So they did a whole episode on colonial teeth. And just you hear about George Washington's fake teeth, but it's actually a very horrifying situation that was happening in colonial America around that time. So there's a lot of amazingly ridiculous stories from American history that get covered in that show.
Yeah. Okay. So some folks have been putting in questions, and so we'll just kind of run through these. So general thoughts on low background noise. Does it contribute positively to the feel of the podcast, or is it distracting?
Oh, that's a great question.
I'll check that one first.
I'll create some background noise.
I know, right? I think it depends on what you're going for, frankly. So the Third Part from the Sun, we intentionally don't want any. We want to have a very slick, well-produced, all you are hearing are our voices and then any sort of B-roll that we're running. And that is intentional and by design. But I've heard some fantastic podcasts that are interviews at a bar or something like that intentionally has a lot of background noise and has a different kind of audience feel to it. And so I think it just depends on what you're going for. I don't think there's any better or worse way to do it.
The noise removal tools I mentioned when I talked about getting good audio or getting good tape, those tools work really well for consistent, persistent noises like the hum of a fan or the hum of a condenser. They don't work very well for being at a conference where the background noise is a lot of different conversations happening. And if you try to do noise removal in those situations, the voices that you're trying to record end up sounding kind of metallic and robotic, if I could describe it that way. And so I have found when I've recorded interviews at AGU's annual conference, and I actually kind of like that there's a little bit of background noise because it, again, that sensation of being in the forest, it gives you the feeling of being at the conference. And I think it makes it sound worse to try to remove it. So for me, it's also, it's a bit of it works both ways. So it would sound worse if I removed it, but I also think that it adds a little bit to the ambiance of the interview in that moment.
Yeah. Another one is, this is actually pretty good. How long to prep for an episode?
That gets back to that trade-off of the more prep you do, the less work you're probably going to have to do afterwards. So for our show, for Science Sortive, we're usually covering one or two science topics. So I will read a Pop Press article or two about those and then skim the actual paper. If we're interviewing the guest, I'll make sure that I have some of their biographical details to read out, like where they went to school. But then because the show is so unscripted and conversational, but we've been doing it for so long, we kind of have like bits of patter that I just kind of have stored in my brain at this point. It doesn't take me nearly as much prep as it used to, but I do spend a lot of time in the edit because I do clean up that sort of conversational style and make everything just a little bit snappier and remove just a little bit of the overly long pauses. So I, at this point, probably spend more time afterwards editing than I spend prepping.
Yeah, and we're the opposite, just because of the design of our podcast. We do a lot more prepping on like setting up interviews, physical interviews, figuring out questions, who's going to be doing that, and then on the because the way our podcast works is it's not one clean cut, or it's just not one interview. There's a lot of myself and my co-host, a co-worker of mine, Nancy. We host the show, and so we actually come up with intro and outro bits. We do a lot of banter between each episode, and so ours, we're kind of the opposite. We don't do a lot of editing. It's hard to put a number on. I mean, it's like hours per week, but that's something we really enjoy. So for us at least, it's worth it.
I've heard a statistic, I haven't actually tested to see if it's true, that it's about four times the work per unit time of actual produced audio. So 4 minutes of work produce 1 minute of audio in the edit. So I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what I've heard.
Yeah, and we kind of touched on this, but folks want to know about kind of the difference between like the interview style podcast versus more produced storytelling, and maybe like pros and cons. And I don't know if there's an answer to that. I think it's just a matter of like what you're interested in. Again, for Third Pod, we split the difference. We like take these interviews that we've done with scientists in person and we chop them up and move them around and everything, but it's an interview podcast. But then to break things up, we do kind of production in the middle. We'll throw in bits, we throw in B-roll, we add things to it that just aren't the interview style. And that's just what we wanted. We didn't want to do a straight interview podcast, but that's just something we fell into.
And your shows also tend to be a lot shorter than my shows overall, and part of that is because we want to maintain as much of the natural flow of the conversation as we can, and that's something that we pitch to our interviewees. We say, hey, if you come on this show, we're not going to cut you off just for time. If you have more to say, if you have something you want to explain in detail, we're going to give you the space to do that, because a podcast isn't like a television show. It can be as long or as short as you want it to be. And so that actually, it's that sort of thing where it's the freedom of freeform poetry. It can, if you don't take it seriously, it can still serve as a detriment. You have to actually be conscientious about why are you being as long as you're being, or why are you cutting it as short as you're cutting it. And as long as you are doing that conscientiously, I think you can produce a good product with either strategy.
Yeah, and again, kind of with going along since we both do interview podcasts in some capacity, do you work out all your questions for interviews beforehand and send them to them, which I think are two separate questions, or more off the cuff?
I never sent interview questions ahead of time because that's a level of organization that I just don't think I possess. There are times where every once in a while, if we're interviewing somebody who's like a bigger name, we'll maybe prep out some questions ahead of time just so we don't stall out. But because we were striving for a very conversational nature, I tend to ask the kind of questions I would ask if I was in a paper reading discussion group of just like, what field experience led to this discovery? What was your moment of like, that's weird? Because, even though the results and the study is going to be different every time, there are certain commonalities to the experience of doing research that if you build questions at the beginning of your interview based around that, they'll usually just kind of lend themselves to flowing into and then what, and then what, and then what. And so I think a kind of consistent launch pad often leads to a really good interview without having to think too much in advance about the specific questions you want to ask.
Yeah, and we do, for our interviews, we don't necessarily have specific topics, but a lot of our interviewers are experienced. They come from the press world, frankly, and are very good at getting good engagement from folks. And again, because we do a lot in post-production, so we are chopping up interviews that way. But I will say, for a lot of the banter that I have with my co-host, we kind of set up these broader topics, because all of our podcasts start with like an introduction where we set a scene or ask like a silly question or something. And there's broad knowledge there. It usually involves myself asking my co-host a silly question. and I tell her broadly what the question is, and then we just go back and forth. So we try to do a healthy mix because it required a little bit more when we first started doing it. It was a lot more structured because we didn't realize like how much structure we would need, but now we found that really nice balance.
Well, what's funny is when we started doing the show, I found that my co-hosts, so not even the people we were interviewing, but just the guys I was trying to do the podcast with, were very stiff. They were very kind of unconfident on the mic. They weren't projecting their voice. They weren't being assertive in the things that they were trying to say. And so I had to figure out vocal exercises to kind of pull them out of their shell a little bit. And so if you've listened to my show before, you know we have a segment called What Are You Drinking? And that's partly to reinforce this sort of happy hour. We're just hanging out, having a good time. I often say that I never want anyone listening to the show to picture anybody speaking at a lectern. Like it's, you know, that would be a failure in my opinion. And so one way I was able to start dragging my co-hosts out of their shell is because, like, yeah, maybe you're a little stiff talking about science because it lends itself to more formalized language. So I would just start off by saying, hey, before we start talking about the topic, what are you drinking? And because we're all like beer nerds, they'd be like, oh, I'm having this IPA with a single origin hop or whatever. And that would get them talking in a way that was much more naturalistic so that when we transitioned into the science, that went much more smoothly. And I thought we got a better overall product from that just kind of silly vocal warm up. And then people dug it as a part of the show. So I just started leaving in the audio.
Yeah. Another one, and this has nothing to do with you or me.
Finally.
But I know, right? But what science podcast do you know of hosted by women? I know Invisibilia is a really great one. It's on NPR. There's Two Scientists, which is it's Two Scientists, which is interviews at a bar with a lot of that's a good way to show there's background noise there, but they're really engaging. There's also
This Podcast Will Kill You, which put out one season, and they haven't come back for season 2 yet, but that's hosted by 2 graduate students, both named Erin, and that's an epidemiology podcast that's hosted by 2 women. Ologies is that podcast I mentioned before where they interview, Allie Ward is the host of that, and she interviews anyone who has an ology on the end of their title. So that gives her a lot of leeway. So she's even talked to people who like develop, makeup and things like that, which I didn't, not to like use that was to me just a very like interesting, like, I never would have thought about like the science that goes into cosmetics. Yeah.
There's, I know of Warm Regards is another one with some really great folks on there. So actually one of our folks who are actually on the webinar, Ramesh, and then also Jacqueline Gill, who I know, hello, and Sarah Myrie. So, and I have listened to your podcast, and I think it's quite lovely.
And we've had Jacqueline on our show as well, and we also, so my show, I tend to be the consistent voice that's on pretty much every episode, but we kind of have a rotating stable of co-hosts that come on and do the show with me. And we've had Kelly Wienersmith on the show, who's also done a Story Collider episode.
Yep.
And she's been one of our co-hosts for 7 or so years, and she and I are great friends at this point. And we also have made it a point, we were in the early days of podcasting, it was a very male-dominated industry, and we were very aware of that in a way that we aimed to do as much as we could about early on, and even just to the point of having more women guests. And so we've had a number of women guests over the years, and we've always tried to focus on making sure that we've got good gender balance when it comes to the voices that we're promoting on the show. So that's, I 100% agree that that's a worthwhile thing to think about in the podcasting landscape.
Yeah, and another question, I don't know if we can actually, this would be an entire thing to cover, but how do you recommend we learn to add narrative qualities to scientific stories, or what are good tricks for engaging an audience? I will say that I think that just a good place to start, just engagement overall, is just think about storytelling more broadly, because I in sharing science, but also because of my affiliation with Story Collider, is that's what we're always thinking about, is telling a good, engaging story. And so looking at kind of outside the podcasting space, but resources on narrative and resources on storytelling and those types of things outside of podcasting, I think can be really great ways to start. And one thing I'll say, and you'll hear this if you listen to our podcast, but also just us in this room, this very hollow room, we are being a bad example of our insulation, but don't be afraid to just show personality or ask questions you wouldn't normally ask, or kind of go a little bit off the cuff or get out of the the very technical, clean, sterile science, because people are listening to your podcast because they want to hear about the people. Like Ryan was saying earlier, it's an intimate experience. And if you're not showing your personality, if you're not adding to that, then folks might tune out. So don't be afraid to just do something, say something in a way in a podcast you might not necessarily say like in a lecture or whatever that might be.
Also, there's nothing wrong with listening to really good story-driven podcasts and then just trying to do something like that yourself, but on your own topic. So, I've learned from listening to Roman Mars' show, and because I've listened to things that he's said in interviews about how he structures his stories, is that in his mind, the human attention span lasts for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes when it comes to an audio story. So if you are putting together an audio-driven story, you have to re-engage with your audience once every 90 to 120 seconds, or you're going to lose them. And so there are little technical tricks like that you can be thinking about when you're putting things together, and maybe you don't need to hold that as a hard and fast rule like he does, but an awareness of that, of like, has this gone on for long enough that we need to switch it up or do something different? And I think there's no substitute for being a ravenous consumer of good stories to learn how good stories are structured and formatted. And then there's also no substitute for just practice. You're not going to be great at it the first couple of times out. I don't know that if I tried, I couldn't walk into Shane's studio with Nance and do an episode of Third Pod from the Sun because I haven't practiced it as much as he has. Even though we both are experienced podcasters at this point, you will just develop your own style, and that's going to be unique to you. And I think if you embrace that and then focus on what works and try to reduce what doesn't, you'll end up with something you're proud of.
Yeah, I think those are really great points. And I think this is kind of a good final thing to end on as we run out of time. But it's another question about suggesting how to make what could be a fairly dry, overly broad topic more engaging.
Ooh, I love this question.
Yeah.
Okay, I have strong opinions. I'm going to second.
Okay. I don't necessarily have strong opinions. All I was going to say is kind of reiterating, but don't be afraid to insert yourself. It's the science is really important, the topic is really important, but the people are important too. And I'll defer to Ryan.
Well, okay, so there's no such thing. I reject the premise that there's something too dry or technical in the first place. If the person studying it, like the person wouldn't be studying it if they weren't passionate about it. All you have to do is unlock their passionate self and let them be a nerd about it, and it becomes engaging. I promise you. It sounds like witchcraft, but it works. If the person has spent their life dedicated to this topic, they can speak passionately about it, and that passion will be infectious when recorded and broadcast back to the listener. So I think if you just let people, like Shane has said a couple of times, insert themselves into the story, make it a story about their passion, make it a story about themselves, then the passion will organically come through in a way that I think means there are no boring topics. One of the biggest hurdles I overcome in doing a podcast that occasionally does interviews is I ask somebody, hey, I think your work's really cool. You want to come on and do an interview? Oh, my work's not interesting. Nobody's going to care about my work. And I'm like, why are you doing it then? Like, well, I think it's interesting. Okay, then come on the show. Convince other people that it's interesting. Like, share what you love about it. And that's what they want to hear. They don't want to hear you be self-deprecating. They don't want to hear you say it's too technical or boring. They want to hear why you've dedicated your life and are pursuing this. So I get very militant when scientists say that their work is too dry, too boring, or doesn't matter, and I don't think such a thing exists. And I think, I think if you let the personality shine through, it can actually still be a good story no matter what the topic.
I think that is a great place to end. So thank you, Ryan, for helping me out today.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
And thanks all of you for being on the webinar. We'll send out an email follow-up probably next week with this recording and some additional details.
And stay tuned for a potential Science Sort of Third Pod crossover at some point.
Yeah, definitely. We'll be trading some secrets in some
capacity.
Yeah, that works. All right. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.